One of the problems that we face with generative AI systems writing code is the problem of hallucinations. And I'm sure you've heard that term, very, very well, because now it's a well-known fact about AI. AI makes a lot of mistakes, and it's a problem for software developers, because the issue is that code is very exact. Compilers are very exact, and it's quite difficult to write code for compilers if you get one thing wrong. Example, a keyword, a character, just a block of code that just doesn't make sense, invalid syntax, and library calls, non-existent method calls, classes, and instances and interfaces that don't make sense, or just don't exist. And it's an issue because the problem is that you have got to stop whatever you're doing. You got to stop, you got to dive into the code, and you got to fix the bugs, and you have to find out which way is suitable to get the problem solved. And with generative AI, that is a very time-consuming process. Vibe coding and the IDEs that just blast out an entire repository of code, a system, or what looks like a system. But the amount of time that's needed to debug the code is tremendous, because you have to write tests, and you have to run the code, and you have to and you have to go through. It's not just one file, it's not just one class, not just one method, one function, one global. It's an entire system altogether. You have the front end, you have the back end, you have the in some languages you have globals that, well, most languages have globals, from PHP to Java, and TypeScript and all this, and you have to debug, you have to hunt down. Now imagine that you've got to do this across thousands of files, and configuration files, test data, and tests and integration tests and container files, and just so many things you got to think about. So the volume here is the problem. Volume of AIslop that developers have to deal with is incredible, and it punctures the narrative of AI vendors that are so bent on driving tech bros, they're so bent on driving the narrative that software developer jobs are just going to be wiped out. No, on the contrary, there will be an increase in the demand for software developers. More and more software developers will be needed to maintain code bases, to fix errors, to shepherd code bases into production, to make sure that they pass the requirements, for example, code quality and static code analysis checks, and a whole bunch of other things, and we have also other challenges. For example, runtime challenges. One of the biggest runtime challenges facing developers is multi-threaded code. How do you write proper functioning, non-buggy, multi-threaded code? Especially for languages like Java, which have a real issue with developers writing synchronized multi-threaded code that is performant, takes advantage of all the processing power available, the compute, and who are able to write proper, non-buggy, non-race, condition-prone code. And the problem with multi-threaded code is that you never know when the bug might appear, because your test might pass, and it could stay hidden for years, and the problem is still there, and one day when the problem rears its head, it can be very disastrous. And I've worked with a company where the bug hit a customer and caused the customer financial stress and problems, and the CEO had to kick in and apologize on behalf of the entire company, and that's really embarrassing and just terrible. So we have the problem now. You might be asking, so why are so many software developers being laid off, especially in the United States, in Silicon Valley? Well, that's a separate problem, and that has got to do with hoarding of developers throughout the years, and we've seen a lot of this problem being we've seen this problem being a huge one, caused by the taking advantage of low interest rates, where money is cheap, and thus the company could afford, all these big tech companies could afford to hoard software developers. In fact, many departments, and even here in Australia, that I know of big companies like banks who have hoarded talent. There are teams where the ratio of project managers or scrum masters to developers is almost 1-to-1. And that was in the days when the interest rates were low, and that was just a few years ago, right after COVID. And then inflation kicked in, and companies realized that they couldn't afford to keep all these people on payroll, and thus now, this year, the economy is in a bad shape. People are worried for their jobs, and rightly so. And as a result, they have scaled back on consumer spending, and that's why we have companies who are hunkering down. And prior to this year, they've already seen the writing on the wall, and they started this massive this massive firing, layoff spree, and that's why we have so many people out of a job. And now the jobs are difficult to get because the consumer demand and consumer sentiment are weak, and it's a global problem. We are seeing it across many countries, and that poses a big challenge for job seekers. So, solution? Well, I suppose that one of the things that people keep talking about is, personal branding, and if you're a software developer, you should have more posts on LinkedIn and videos. That's my viewpoint, and that's what I think. Your mileage may vary, but I think that it's always better to be more visible than not. So now that's an entirely new section that we might talk about in another video. But I just want to point out that, back to my original point, AI generates incredible amounts of slop, and this isn't going away, and this volume of slop will just become more and more a burden financially and operationally for companies, for CEOs and directors. And we've already seen the frustration of open source maintainers who are so frustrated with this volume of slop coming in that they're banning people from, who have a history, or bots from filing any further reports. So that's one reason why AI won't be replacing jobs anytime soon, because the volume of slop is going to hurt companies, and that is not what companies want in this day and age, where it's prudent to keep things operationally lean and agile.